Hello, everyone. I know this is going to be a bit outside of what we usually do, but we figured with the coronavirus, the economy tanking a little bit and whatnot, it would be a good idea to just kind of discuss the subject of homesteading, which is a subject that I think everybody that's going to be talking today is fairly passionate about.
Yeah, we have with us today Mr. Arthur Cox, who happens to be both my father in law and pastor, and somewhat of an expert, though he wouldn't call himself that, on homesteading and just kind of different aspects to that, getting started with off grid power and gardening, etc. Yeah, Art, you want to just say hi and let us know a little bit about kind of what got you started into homesteading.
Yeah. Hey, well, first, I just want to say, hey, thanks for having me on, guys. Really, it's kind of an interesting thing. The whole homesteading thing has been, it's kind of come in waves. It seems like, but for myself, it all started for me back in 1990, actually, and it kind of has an interesting kind of a way it all played out. I was sitting in a factory and I was working long hours and I was just realizing that boy, this is a drag, but I felt trapped. I had at the time I had three kids and fairly newly married, just a few years married, and I just really felt like, wow. I mean, I've got all this responsibility laying on me, and I've got a house payment, I've got kids to take care of, and so forth. I just really felt like, this was a burden. I just, you were expected to bear. You got a family, and for me, it wasn't a 9 to 5; it was a 12 to 12. 4 days on, 4 days off. And the 4 days off sounds good, but you're exhausted the first day off and you got to get rested the first day you go back. So you really only get 2 days anyway. So when I was just, I was working one evening. It's probably over a span of several evenings, but I remember one in particular. The job I had was a very fast paced job, but you had a lot of time to think. It was not one of those kind of a jobs where you had to use your brains. You just kind of had to use your hands and get the job done. And anyway, I had lots of time to pray and lots of time to just seek the Lord. And I was just praying one night and just realizing, Lord, is this really it for me? I mean, this really feels like I'm kind of at the end of my rope here, as far as, is this really what I'm going to do for the rest of my life? And I just acknowledge him. I have a burden that I got to feed my family, and I've got to take care of them all. And then it dawned on me. I had been reading the Sermon on the Mount and so forth, and it dawned on me that the Lord promises in there that he is our provider, that he is the one by which we will find our substance and so forth. And I realized for the first time, and I know that sounds kind of strange. I'd been a believer now for about 3.5, 4 years. But for the first time, the realization hit me that it really wasn't my responsibility as much as it was the Lord's promise that he was going to provide through me. And I didn't feel all alone all of a sudden. And I started to realize that maybe I didn't have to be stuck at this kind of a job for the rest of my life. Maybe my future could expand into something else. And so as I began to pray more and more about the whole thing, a plan started to kind of form in my mind, and I believed it was from the Lord at the time. I still do. And so I put this plan together with the leading of the Lord. And so I took this big step one day. It was kind of scary, but I took this big step and I went home. And I told my wife, I said, Anna Lou, I really believe that the Lord wants us to sell our house here in town and buy a piece of property out in the country And I had been looking a little bit out in the country, and I'd found 6 acres. That's all it was just 6 acres. And I said, I believe we should move out into the country, and that we should just start all over and homestead that property. Well, she wasn't real excited about that because that just sounds a little bit scary. And I didn't have any big plans. I didn't know how we were going to do it or nothing. But I really felt convicted to do this. And she agreed. She followed me along in it. Long story short, I'm going to move a little quicker. We sold our house in town and we bought this piece of property out in the country, about 5 miles out of Macomb, Illinois. And there was nothing on the property. So we had a tent. And for 6 weeks, my wife and I and 3 little ones, our youngest one was about 9 months old, 8 months old. And we lived in a tent for 6 weeks. And there's so many stories about that. I can't get into them, but you can probably imagine some of them. We had a few rainstorms and things like that. And it was August. It was a little bit warm from time to time, and
Annalie was thrilled, right?
And so from nothing, we started cutting down some trees and getting a place cleared, and we dug a whole bunch of post holes because I built the cabin on post because there was not a level spot on the property, and so we cemented all these posts, and finally we framed up this cabin. And so we built this cabin. And in 6 weeks, we got this cabin started and finished enough to get inside. And it wasn't done by all means, but it was much better than in a tent. So we moved into the cabin while we were still working on it. And that was about mid-September. About the 1st of October, it was done. Well, it was done in a primitive kind of a way. There was no bathroom. Well, there was a bathroom, but it was a non-functioning bathroom. It was a bathroom with hopes of someday it functioning as a real bathroom. So we had a little porta potty in there, and we had a tub it had a drain that drained basically outside onto the ground. But there was no water in the cabin because there was no well. So we'd have to carry our water from the creek bed for washing and for laundry and so forth. And we would haul water in gallon jugs from the city of Macomb to drink. Well, that's how it got started. It was 6 1/4 acres, but it was out in the country. It was a beautiful piece of property. And we started homesteading from there. And, it's kind of interesting because since then, from that time, I didn't know it, but really behind the scenes, there was a movement really happening. And it was not only a homesteading movement, it was an intentional community movement among believers. Now, if you go back into the 60s and 70s, intentional communities were a fairly wide thing within our nation. But it was more of the hippies. It was more of a kind of the part of that hippie movement and so forth. And a lot of that died out because they really didn't have a lot of commitments and so forth. And when under the trial of many years, they kind of died out. But there was a revival of this in some sorts right around that exact same time that I had moved out and started this homestead. Now, my desire was to do an intentional community, but I could never find like-minded believers who really wanted to do that. But I didn't know, but there was a movement actually starting up among Christians with regard to intentional communities where many people live on the same piece of property, and it comes in many different applications, but sometimes it's everybody sharing all of the money and they're all putting the proceeds in. Sometimes it's fairly individual where there's a lot of privacy and a lot of individualism within it and everything in between. I didn't know that there was really a big movement starting at that time, but there was. And all I knew is I felt that this is what the Lord had wanted me to do.